The darkness finally pulled away, and Joseph found himself staggering under the pebbly beach. He gasped as his lungs burned for air, and he fell to one knee. Behind him, the last remnants of the soldiers who had survived their encounter with the nightmare creatures pushed their way out of the haunted forest in a similar state of that of the young dwarf priest. Joseph was relieved to see Aelmund was among the survivors, standing with his hands on his knees a few feet down. As the world ceased to spin and his vision cleared from the dots of exertion that still swam in the corners of his eyes, Joseph looked up and gasped. The landing boats were gone. Joseph threw his gaze further out to sea and saw that there was still a larger ship anchored in the harbor, but where had the others gone? Joseph squinted. Why did that ship look so familiar? "Everyone, find cover!" Aelmund's voice hissed through the still air, and soon everything was a blur, as all the soldiers tried to find some place to hide themselves, not even knowing in which direction the unseen threat Aelmund had spied might threaten them. Still, they lunged behind sandbars, larger rocks, and fallen trees. Some of the braver ones even retreated into the outlier portions of the forest. Joseph tried to make himself as flat as possible behind a half-buried boulder. He looked around and caught Aelmund's eye, who was leaning against a piece of scrub brush that barely covered him. Aelmund motioned with his chin in the direction before them, and Joseph turned to follow his gaze. What he saw froze his blood. A boat was approaching the beach about a quarter of a mile from where they stood, but even at this distance Joseph could recognize it, and as he did so he felt a wave of déjà vu. The disconcerting sensation was so strong that he would have fallen had he not already been lying on the ground. Joseph saw a very familiar figure standing in the prow of the boat. He knew that figure well. He saw it every time he looked in a mirror. His mind spun in an attempt to understand this information. Time doesn't work the same in the forest when you're near the other side. His mind wrestled with this thought, remembering his conversation with Aelmund the first time he had emerged from the darkness. It had seemed like a lifetime ago. And yet... Joseph watched as the boat made landfall on the shore and the dwarven scouts leapt off the boat and prepared to enter the forest. Joseph watched his past self jump down and issue orders, just as he remembered doing not so long ago. After several minutes of discussion, the team moved into the shadow of the woods and were lost from sight. The boat lay beached in the shallows. Joseph had remembered that he hadn't left anyone to guard it because he hadn't expected to be gone for very long, and felt they would need the help if they ran into trouble while scouting the woods. Slowly he stood, knowing that his team was going to their doom, and also knowing, because of Aelmund, that no one would be coming back for several weeks. A thought had begun to germinate in his brain, a plan that could possibly change everything. Around him, the other survivors began to emerge from their hiding spots as well. Joseph didn't wait for them and instead began running for the boat, bobbing up and down in the shallows. Aelmund called after him as he ran, but he didn't stop till his hands touched the rough wood of the boat's side. "I have an idea of what we can do," he wheezed breathlessly, knowing that the elf was likely already behind him. "We can save everyone." "No," Aelmund responded. His voice was cold. "You dinna even know what I was going to say." "You want to take the ship back and stop us from ever coming to this accursed place, right?" The elf's voice was hollow. There was no emotion left in his body. Joseph turned to look at him. "How did you know?" he asked. "It's obvious that the forest has spit us out at the exact time that you arrived here with your original team. But think about what might happen if you did go back now. Let's say you made it back to Calicdroom before we were dispatched to rescue you. After all, we're not going to be leaving to come here for at least another 2 months from this day. If I am correct in that the darkness has fed us out in the past, as I feel that it has." Aelmund spun Joseph round to face him. "Now, let's say you make it back," he continued, "and you stop us from ever coming to this nightmarish hellhole. I would be willing to risk my soul on the very chance that you could work such a miracle. But then, if we never come, who will save you when you run back out of that forest? Who will then launch the assault that will bring you to the void at the center of this forest?" "I dinna understand." Joseph squinted at the elf. "If we never come to these shores, Joseph, you will die here, and the Alliance at Calicdrum will never receive the information that you bear. If you die before emerging from that forest a second time, then you will never be able to go back and warn us not to come. If we do not come, you are not saved and cannot go back to warn us not to come. And so the vicious cycle repeats and repeats until the everything comes to ruin. That kind of paradox could lead to a second shattering of this world, which has already been broken once because of time manipulation. Think of the repercussions that such an act could cause. It seems the exact kind of thing that these nightmares would wish for, to sow chaos and destruction on this world. Something that would bring them closer to finally being able to break through that veil. Aylmer motioned back towards the forest and the rift beyond. "So what can I do?" Joseph's voice was a terrified whisper. Before Aylmer could respond, shadow creatures emerged from the forest, and in a cloud of slithering movement began to charge the surviving soldiers gathered around the solitary boat. Aylmer drew his sword and began calling out orders. The wary warriors shuffled into a defensive line with their backs to the water. The elf turned back to the dwarf and growled, "Get in the boat and start back to the ship. You'll need to wait at least 2 months before making contact with Calicdrum. That way you don't interfere with the timeline we've already established." Joseph hesitated, staring beyond the elf at the coming tide of dark monstrosities that was already closing on the doomed soldiers before them. "Go!" Aylmer snarled, almost hauling Joseph into the boat himself. "This is more important than us. You must get the information back to Calicdrum." Joseph struggled as he tumbled into the boat with a dull thud, and stood up to stare back at the elf. Aylmer called out to 3 other elves who ran over, and together they pushed the small boat out into the deeper water. Joseph stared at them as he drifted away. "May the gods watch over ye, Aylmer, Prince of the Ice Kindred, and keep you safe on the way to your ancestors' halls." The customary benediction that was given at Calicdrum's funerals seemed oddly hollow in the dwarf's ears as the figures on the beach grew smaller. His forlorn prayer was lost as the soldiers began fighting with the dark beasts that charged them, and the noise of battle expunged all other thoughts from the fighters' minds. Joseph watched until he could no longer make out the individual figures still standing on the beach. The last he ever saw of Aylmer was watching the elf calling out orders behind the last remaining elven spearman directly in front of him, his strong voice echoing out over the bay. "Hold the lines, warriors! Make them pay in blood for every step they take!" The gem that had fused with Joseph's hand began to glow purple in the light of a setting sun.